4. Fear is a page of the government playbook. Fear is the foundation of most governments. John Adams, founding father and second president of the United States. Once upon a time, the fear of nuclear war traveled on the wind from a snowy, faraway country, where an abstract red button might be pushed. The Cold War marks a starting point, out of a number you could pick, in the trajectory of the threats we have faced in modern times and the fears they inspired. In this trajectory, the weapons we fear have become smaller and the enemies closer to home. COVID did not travel on the wind of a weapon of mass destruction. We were told it is a stowaway on human breath. The threat is from the intimate whisper of your lover, pleasantries exchanged with a shop assistant, the convivial conversation of friends in a pub, a hug from your grandchild, or silent travelers on public transport. The danger is not an enemy on the other side of the world, but every single person you come into contact with. And that means you are their enemy too. The War on Terror bridged an arc of exploitable fears between the Cold War and COVID. Terrorists could inflict destruction anywhere, at any time. They might be from faraway lands, but they could also be among us in a world of leaky borders, immigration and air travel. Suspicion could be directed at anyone who leaves a bag on the train station platform, or who looks like a certain type. Terrorism is smaller in scale than nuclear war. It destroys a building, or a bus, not a continent or a country, yet it is unnervingly random. But an infectious virus makes terrorists of us all. Anyone on the train station platform or next to you in the pub could present a danger, not just a certain type. The weapon we find ourselves at war with has reduced in size from nuclear bomb behemoth, to weapons concealed on the body, to the body itself. The enemy shifted from a foreign government, to foreign terrorists, to every single one of us. Geopolitical borders are now not just between countries but between our own bodies. We must stay apart, observe distances of 2 meters, wear masks, not shake hands or hug. All for our own safety. In 2020, we became the enemy. Once lockdown was announced, passers-by on pavements danced a nervous minuet, keeping a formal distance from each other, skirting the edges of pathways, or huffing and puffing with ostentatious righteousness into the road. The anxiety was palpable in public in the spring of 2020. Many proclaimed on social media how angry they were when people broke the rules and breached their 2-meter perimeter. People were scared, skittish, and defended their new borders from intruders. Can we be at war with a virus? Politicians and journalists think so. The language is martial. It's the greatest threat in peacetime. We are at war with a virus. We will defeat it. NHS workers are on the front line. The report Behavioral Government, one produced for the government in 2018, observed the importance of framing policies and the language used into a coherent and comprehensible pattern, by providing a powerful governing image or metaphor. The report gives the examples of describing crime as a beast, or as a virus infecting the city. Of course, language used by ministers is, at least sometimes, considered very carefully. Donald Trump kept calling COVID the Chinese virus, a foreign threat equivalent to a hostile nation. Angela Merkel said COVID was the greatest threat Germany had faced since 1945. Boris Johnson did his best to channel Churchill. In a speech too in the summer of 2020 he compared Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, to NATO, revealing a seismic paradigm shift in how we perceive our enemies. The Metro's front cover headline was, "Careless Talk Costs Lives" on 12 January 2021, evoking the Second World War. Truthfully, no government can believe that the virus can be defeated like an enemy nation. It's a very different proposition. So what do governments hope to achieve with this fighting talk? War appeals to the ego, to the need to exert control. To offer hope of winning when we feel out of control. It's easier to cast a virus in the role of opponent. But viruses are endemic. They are part of our history, our present and our future. In fact, they are part of us. Our DNA actually contains about 100,000 pieces of viral DNA, 8% of the human genome. Governments may feel obliged to do whatever it takes to steer us through a crisis, and that means we have to swallow it like bitter medicine, even if we don't like it. War requires populations to be resilient, make sacrifices and obey their leaders, like soldiers obeying the chain of military command. Martial language reminds us of this. This epidemic's course has been measured in deaths and cases. Wars are normally counted in victories, not fallen and wounded. Soldiers, those counts are saved till the end, but we were the fallen. Daily body counts reminded us of the sacrifice, kept the fear alive, and primed us for compliance. Fear works best in wartime. History shows us that governments have long used fear to control populations, from the ancient Egyptians to the vast campaigns of terror committed by totalitarian governments in China, Russia and Germany in the 20th century. The «reign of terror» during the French Revolution, and the term «Project Fear», used to describe the referenda for Scottish independence and the UK's membership of the EU, did what they said on the tin. British propaganda was accelerated during the First World War through the War Propaganda Bureau, using films, the press and advertisements. You might be familiar with the graphical depictions of the evil German Hun during the First World War, and with the mobilization of the UK state apparatus to encourage its people to fight. Since then we have honed our skills. The weapons are sharper. Following the bloodshed of that period, the pioneering psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud wrote much about human nature, that there was a pleasure principle, in which we are driven to pursue gratification, and a reality principle, in which society must restrict and control the instinctual desires in all people, to a socially productive end. His nephew, Edward Bernays, who was living in America, took many of these ideas on board and pioneered the public relations industry, named as such because he understood the negative connotations with the existing term, propaganda. In his book Propaganda, published in 1928, Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country." Just how far do governments go? Edward Bernays offers a perfect example of how it's done, and it's worth meandering at this point, away from COVID, to illustrate how a government will leverage fear and propaganda. Bernays argued in the U.S. in the 1950s that instead of reducing people's fear of communism and nuclear war, it should be exaggerated, but in such a way that it became a weapon in the Cold War. Essentially, he wanted to weaponize the U.S. population's fear. In his series Century of the Self, Adam Curtis illustrated how Bernays helped to eject the popularly elected Guatemalan leader, Juan Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, and restore the malleable, Banana Republic dictators controlled by the U.S.'s United Fruit Company. And he did it in a way that made it look like a victory for American democracy. He organized a trip to Guatemala for journalists and arranged for them to meet selected politicians who told them that Arbenz was a communist in league with Moscow. During the trip there was a violent anti-American riot, which some believed Bernays arranged. He set up a news agency called the Middle America News Bureau and pushed out news stories saying that Guatemala was going to be used as a beachhead for a communist invasion of the U.S. The New York Herald Tribune, Time, Newsweek, and Atlantic Monthly all described the threat and called for U.S. government action. At the same time, the United Fruit Company sent favorable articles and reports to Congress members and journalists. Bernays was also part of a secret CIA plot to remove Arbenz and reinstall a puppet dictator. Howard Hunt, CIA officer, confessed that they organized a terror campaign. The CIA ran a psyop to present military defeat as a foregone conclusion in Guatemala, and military support was provided to the new dictator of choice. Bernays created the conditions in the public and the press to reshape political reality through this cleverly crafted campaign using universities, lawyers, the media, business and government. The reason it all worked? He exploited fear and manipulated people. He believed in democracy. He just thought people were too stupid to be trusted with it and that rational argument was fruitless. He called his process the engineering of consent. Propaganda, as a heavy blunt instrument, had been used for centuries, but Bernays set out a clear scientific framework for how to engineer the consent of the public, even warning that these tools could just as easily be employed by demagogues. The key point is that Bernays saw himself as a true and liberal patriot, helping benevolent governments and organizations to overcome the irrational drives in their people to reach an altruistic goal. Modern politicians and behavioral scientists might agree with his ambition. At around the same time, in 1957, William Sargent explained in his book, Battle for the Mind, how politicians and religious leaders use brainwashing techniques, specifically highlighting the importance of fear in causing alteration in brain function to increase suggestibility. He gave China's Cultural Revolution as a specific example. Fear of continued civil war, or foreign intervention, or both, convinced the Chinese communist leaders they must use shock tactics to convert the masses. A more intellectual approach might have resulted in a more stable type of conversion, but it would have taken dangerously long, and been consummated only with the gradual dying off of those brought up in the old ways of thought, and the growing up of the children in the new. To make a new China overnight, emotional disruption was essential, and so effective were the methods used, that thousands killed themselves in despair, leaving the more resilient millions to dance for joy at their liberation from millenniary bondage, until they learned to tremble at the periodic visits of the household police who now keep a dossier on the history and activities of every household. Between all these examples and the present day, has anything fundamental about humanity changed? That doesn't seem likely. No doubt governments and psychologist advisors are as tempted, and populations are as pliable. An alarmed populace will desire to be led to safety by its government. The more severe the emergency, the more a population will appreciate strong government. In the U.S., they call it rallying around the flag. In Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard, which explored the use of depth psychology and subliminal research in post-war United States consumerism, the perfect president is described as a father image. In an obvious and visceral attempt to convey a strong paternal leadership, Boris Johnson said the government would put its arms around every single worker during the epidemic. Some might welcome the embrace of the state, while others feel it as a stranglehold. People willingly sacrifice liberty for security during a crisis. This is not a simple exchange though. What does security mean? And does liberty returned when the crisis has passed? After a crisis, some governments may wish to lengthen the state of fear, or exaggerate it, to keep the population obedient. Early in 2020, the people of the world realized en masse they would die. Of course, they were always going to die. But they believed they could die then, or soon, as a result of the epidemic. Mortality felt real. It could be that a modern-day death phobia, or at least our disconnect from death, has primed us for an overreaction. If you haven't accepted you will die one day, you are a sitting duck for policies which claim to be for your safety. There is mixed evidence about the efficacy of lockdowns. We do know that they have cost lives. For a fuller explanation, see Appendix 2. Yet people traded their liberty in the hope that the government knew best. Robert Higgs, the American economic historian, said, "The masses can be turned around on a dime on the basis of a crisis, even a bogus crisis. The politicians will quickly come running round to exploit on a crisis." He has good form for predicting the effects of crisis on government. In his book Crisis and Leviathan he postulated that the First World War, Great Depression, Second World War, Johnson-Nixon years, 9/11 and the Great Recession that started in 2008 all caused the U.S. government to expand, in a pattern he calls the ratchet effect. Effectively, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government measure. A crisis, Higgs observed, alters the fundamental conditions of political life. Like a river suddenly swollen by the collapse of an upstream dam, the ideological current becomes bloated by the public's fear and apprehension of impending dangers and its heightened uncertainty about future developments. Bewildered people turn to the government to resolve the situation, demanding that government officials do something to repair the damage already done and prevent further harm. In an interview for Reason magazine on 20 September 2001, 9 days after 9/11, Higgs was asked about the future of the U.S. and its government, based on his studies of crises in the past. He accurately predicted more surveillance, the military increasingly being used for domestic duties, the enlargement of the Big Brother state, and that terrorism would not be wiped out. So, what does Higgs predict will happen as a result of the COVID crisis? In short, associated government measures will leave an abundance of legacies for the worse so far as people's freedom is concerned. Point 4. There were significant changes in the UK following acts of terror too. The prevent policy is one of the most significant of recent years. In 2015, it became a legal duty for public sector institutions to effectively engage in surveillance of the population for signs of extremism and radicalization. We should remember that extremism and radicalization are not illegal, and who gets to define them anyway? Let's not forget that the suffragettes were considered extremists in their time. The Investigatory Powers Act 2016 followed the controversy over bulk data collection by authorities which had been revealed in the famous Snowden leaks, and aimed to create a firmer legal footing for bulk collection and interception of communications, including your internet browsing histories. It allowed police and other governmental organizations to access information. Effectively, it legalized the mass surveillance that Snowden had revealed. The Terrorism Act 2000 enabled arrest without charge beyond 24 hours and stop and search without suspicion. This basically allows people to be held for considerable periods of time without charge and for that to be extended, whereas normally the police can only hold you for 24 hours without charge. Chillingly, the UK might also have been caught up in torture since 9/11.5. What was the risk to the UK population which justified these far-reaching policies of mass surveillance, stop and search and detention? Acts of terror create a whiplash of shock and fear. But in fact, from 1975 to 2018, the risk of dying in a terrorist attack in the UK was 1 in 11.4 million per year. 6. The risk of being injured was 1 in 496,464. It's imperative we understand how much fear clouds our perception of risk. I interviewed Silke Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch, about the parallels between the changes to UK law and society after 9/11 and what we are experiencing since COVID. She didn't hold back. COVID has given the world an electric shock. It's a time when measures can be introduced and there is little bandwidth for people to oppose. The extent of the changes this year is going to affect everything about being human. The point about liberties is when you restrict them, you don't just restrict the legal aspect of liberty. You restrict life itself. The reason we are in the situation we are in now is because of the precedents that were set after 9/11. While we talked, I felt a recognition in my gut of my own fears this year. She told me that after the War on Terror, we were left with a raft of counter-terror legislation which had implications beyond counter-terror. It justified the global mass surveillance architecture that we passively live under now. As I had envisaged an arc of fear from the Cold War to the present day, Carlo noted how the state had exploited that fear. There were warnings from congressmen during the Cold War when fear was whipped up about Reds under the bed, that we could take surveillance so far that it would prohibit the possibility for resistance to form. The big change we were left with was the massive internalization of fear and suspicion. There is a hyper-focus on security. It's moved our dial on the preservation of democracy. Fear justifies actions which are purely performative. Someone seizes your tweezers at the airport for safety. And you tolerate it. That is the end of rationality. Tony Blair used the threat of terrorism to give him a new moral authority. Fear of the enemy is how politicians maintain power and advance agendas. The Labour government's military intervention in Iraq is believed to have motivated and strengthened terrorist groups and led to terrorist actions in the UK, from the 7/7 London bombings in 2005 to the London Bridge attack in 2017. Those acts of terrorism were in turn used to justify restrictions on liberty. In The Power of Nightmares, Adam Curtis says that politicians will eventually have to concede that some threats are exaggerated and others have no foundation in reality. That, in an age when all the grand ideas have lost credibility, fear of a phantom enemy is all the politicians have left to maintain their power. Are viruses and variants to be the phantom enemy? At the outset of the epidemic, politicians, journalists and even scientists may have overestimated its deadliness. This is due to lack of knowledge, common early on in an epidemic, caution and even fear. But as the year wore on, it became clear that COVID was less lethal than feared. Globally, the average infection fatality rate, IFR, is 0.15% and the median IFR for under 70-year-olds is 0.05%. Yet the UK government pursued lockdowns and strategies which created other impacts on mortality from other causes. Cancelled GP appointments, led to businesses closing and jobs lost, children missing school, local elections cancelled, and many basic liberties curtailed. The focus switched from deaths to the reproduction number, to cases, to hospitalizations, to vaccine rollout. The goalposts also moved. Flatten the curve was followed by slowing the spread. Then we dabbled with suppression. The notion of zero COVID was floated. There were fears about a second wave. Then we were in it. Or at least a bad winter surge. Then waiting for a vaccine. The vaccine arrived. Then we were told that wouldn't mean restrictions could be lifted. The inevitable third wave was mentioned, and fears raised about a new transmissible variant, COVID-21 next perhaps. Then there are variants or scariants, as they were termed by cynics. We seem to be caught in an endless bait and switch. The virus narrative makes us enemies of each other, which is used to justify impositions on our freedoms and the manipulation of our fears. History shows that people in wars, or considered dangerous, have been imprisoned, put in concentration camps, tortured and suffered the loss of human rights. War and terror justify a security state. The virus justifies a biosecurity state. Is the average person to consider themselves lethally infectious, unless proven otherwise using an enabling test? 9. Are we bioterrorists? On the 26th of March 2021, Dr. Sarah Jarvis said, "Breathing is an offensive weapon if you are infected with COVID," on Channel 5's Jeremy Vine on 5 show. Even allowing for a bit of dramatic license on telly, it is impossible to imagine someone saying that pre-COVID. On the 18th of August 2020, Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, announced that the new National Institute for Health Protection's single and relentless mission would be protecting people from external threats to this country's health. And what are these threats? Apparently they are biological weapons, pandemics, and of course infectious diseases of all kinds. Is it the state's role to protect us from infectious diseases of all kinds? Notice how many governments and organizations, including the UK government, started referring to the new normal in the spring of 2020. Lockdown legally started on the 26th of March 2020, and as early as the 26th of April Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, said that Britain would be moving to a new normal. That term framed our expectations for the future, because it implied that normal, our old normal, real normal, was gone and to be replaced by something new. It signaled a move from one type of society to another. A comparison with the Nazis might invite frustration in the skeptical reader, but consider the name, Das Dritte Reich. The Third Reich was a clever title, because it planted the idea in the minds of the German people that Hitler's style of government wasn't for a term, it wasn't a fad, it was their present and their future. How did we move so fast from an emergency situation to a term which seeds the idea the future will be forever different? We were supposed to lock down for 3 weeks to flatten the curve. Why would that necessitate a new normal? A 3-week intervention and a new normal cannot logically coexist. What made governments think that COVID-19 would be different from every infectious respiratory disease the world has ever known? Respiratory diseases follow a bell curve. They come and then they go. Why would normal have to be permanently altered for this respiratory disease? And why would that be proclaimed so early? A biosecurity state, where we are advised to follow directives to wash hands, socially distance and remember, hands, face, space, is one thing. A legally directed biosecurity state which mandates staying at home is another. We have never before quarantined the healthy and impeded so many human rights in one fell swoop. Our rights to liberty, protest, worship, education and maintaining relationships were all impacted. And these are not trifling privileges, but basic liberties, our human rights as established in law. I experienced the curtailment of the right to protest personally, and I realized that the attitude towards protest in the UK this year has been indicative of a government that wanted to control more than infection. "Go home now or you'll be arrested," an aggressive policeman shouted in my face. He barked orders and questions at me. I had attended an anti-lockdown protest in London on the 28th of November in my capacity as a journalist and press photographer, and witnessed the police using excessive force. I had just been photographing an arrest on a fairly empty stretch of pavement on Oxford Street, a long way behind the protest which had moved on. I showed the police officer my press pass. He wasn't satisfied and demanded my password to check it was real. His intimidating manner flummoxed me, and instead of asking what I had done which was unlawful, nothing, I set about retrieving my personal password to my press association. If he didn't believe me, he should have just called the number on the back of the press card. It was unorthodox and inappropriate to ask for my personal password. I can't believe I even started looking, but fear clouds your judgment. After a couple of minutes with the bad cop, a relatively good cop took over and was satisfied by my press pass. I had not done anything unlawful after all. After being subjected to several rounds of Kafkaesque questioning, the 4 police officers who had surrounded me moved on. Shockingly, another press photographer I spoke to was shoved twice by the police. One time, his camera was grabbed by a police officer who pushed it in his face to move him on. Allowing press photographers and journalists to do their work is essential to a free press and democracy. The attitude towards us was obstructive and intimidating. Unfortunately, what we experienced was typical of the force and intimidation which was turned on the protesters that day. There seemed to be a deliberate strategy of making lots of arrests in order to create a politicized media story. Hundreds of police officers picked off protesters from the edges and back of the protest, like sharks feeding off a shoal of fish, and put them in vans which were lining the streets. The peaceful protest saw violence later in the day, which I'd suggest was at least partially caused by the brute and excessive policing. On the same day there were crowds of people at Borough Market and Chelsea Farmers Market, to give just 2 London examples. 2 weeks later there were crowds of people on Oxford Street Christmas shopping. Why are some crowds tolerated, but peaceful political marches and protests clamped down on hard? Does the virus behave differently in different types of crowds? Of course not. We have to conclude that the government and the Met Police seem to be more concerned about political contagion than viral contagion. Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, has written about the reduction of life to biopolitics. To simply reduce the theory, he says that the man who is accursed can be set apart from normal society, and must live a bare life, life reduced to the barest form. In the worst examples, the accursed are put in concentration camps, where a state of exception becomes the rule, and normal laws and morals are forgotten. Guantanamo is a modern example. The bare life of the prisoners was such that the only protest left to them, hunger strike, was also dominated by the brutal policy of the wardens, and they were force-fed and anally rehydrated as a form of torture. The prisoner's geopolitical border of the body was destroyed by the captor. This is a disturbing example of a government taking away rights and creating fear. The UK government has said many times that healthy people can still be infectious, therefore we can all be the accursed to a degree. This is despite numerous studies showing that asymptomatic transmission is not a serious risk. And Dr. Fauci proclaiming in 2020 on US television that an epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers. Has much of the world been turned, without our understanding or noticing, into a state of exception? The camp can also be metaphorical. We don't need to be relocated. We can be locked down at home too. Home is clearly not a concentration camp. There are no barbed wires or machine gun towers, and I do not want to stretch this metaphor into melodrama, but nonetheless it is a confinement. For those in cramped and inadequate homes, the confinement is more serious. We were presumed infectious rather than healthy. Our geopolitical borders were determined to be unreliable. Thus our normal rights were restricted, and for some self-isolation felt like a form of torture. Beyond the metaphorical, China forced 800,000 people into quarantine, and its use of stadiums as mass isolation areas was chillingly reminiscent of concentration camps. In Israel, the publication Haaretz described ultra-Orthodox Jews who do not follow the state's rules as COVID insurgents and terrorists 11 in starkly obvious biopolitical language. In a particularly hyperbolic description, maskless individuals are accused of setting off epidemiological time bombs. We should be alert to similar, albeit less extreme, moves in Europe. The Times headline, "Hunt for mystery person who tested positive for Brazilian COVID-19 variant then vanished," 12 evoked a slightly aggressive image of a hunt for a person carrying a new COVID variant, as though a bioterrorist was dangerously on the loose with a weapon. 4 states in Germany announced plans to create detention centers for those who violate lockdown measures, using specially built facilities, a refugee camp and a juvenile detention center guarded by police. Public health mutated into crime and punishment, all made possible by emergency laws. Some people will believe that if you break the rules you should accept the consequences, tough. But we must remember that these rule breakers were healthy, not necessarily infectious, people. The PCR test used to determine infectiousness is not actually a good indication of infectiousness, believe it or not. The management of the epidemic rested strongly on the use of the PCR test. As the Public Health England document Understanding Cycle Threshold, Court, in SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR, a guide for health protection teams says, a single court value in the absence of clinical context cannot be relied upon for decision-making about a person's infectivity. 13 And as the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University said, PCR detection of viruses is helpful so long as its accuracy can be understood. It offers the capacity to detect RNA in minute quantities, but whether that RNA represents infectious virus may not be clear. 14. In Guidelines for NHS Staff. 15 The government wrote that staff who had already had COVID should be exempted from mass screening tests because fragments of inactive virus can be persistently detected by PCR in respiratory tract samples following infection, long after a person has completed their isolation period and is no longer infectious. Think of all the people who tested positive and did self-isolate when they may no longer have been infectious. Of those, how many broke self-isolation and were punished? In November 2020, the Portuguese High Court ruled that PCR test results alone could not be used to enforce self-isolation. They must be accompanied by clinical diagnosis. 16 The legal detention of healthy people is permitted by emergency laws but enabled by a narrative of dehumanization. People who break the rules are dangerous. They might be infectious, stupid, and socially irresponsible. People have been instructed not to work, have relationships or touch other people. These are rules which would have sounded outlandish, cruel and impossible not long ago. The number of people attending funerals was restricted. The elderly were left unvisited in care homes, and women birthed without their partners, to give just a few examples of exceptions to the normal moral and human rights which were impeded or suspended. Lockdown itself is prison terminology. Only wrongdoers are locked down. At least in law you are innocent until proven guilty. In our biosecurity state we are assumed infectious until proven healthy. How do you leave the camp? The world of confinement, social distancing rules and restrictions. In time, when the government determines the epidemic has run its course? Or perhaps the answer lies in a vaccine, to be delivered en masse in 2021? The choice to take a vaccine is a marvelous modern medical blessing, as long as resuming sovereignty of your life does not mean foregoing sovereignty of your body. Beyond choice, we should be vigilant about the danger of mandation and the more subtle, but no less powerful, threat of coercion, for example by offering a return to normal civic and social life with a vaccine passport, or COVID status certificate, or double-speak, freedom app. The worst threat, mandation, would signal loss of bodily sovereignty, in the same way as a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay tube-fed against his will. Coercion is more nuanced, but over time would it create a two-tier society of vaccinated, safe people and unvaccinated, unsafe people? Would the unvaccinated be considered reckless, socially irresponsible or stupid? These are values which push them further into a less than status. Note that Matt Hancock linked personal responsibility 17 with the 2021 vaccine rollout, the implication being that the choice not to vaccinate is irresponsible. Nick Cohen wrote in The Guardian, "It is only a matter of time before we turn on the unvaccinated." 18 A German doctor 19 called for people who refuse the vaccination to be refused hospital treatment if they become sick with COVID. This is not how national healthcare has been provided in Germany or the UK. It is available to all. Obesity is one of the key indicators of ICU treatment and death from COVID. It would be equally monstrous to propose that the overweight may not be treated in ICU, because they did not show personal responsibility for their health. The accursed are less than their fellow humans. This is why it is important to always be aware of language and policy which others and dehumanizes. The media and social media have reverberated with language like COVIDiots, selfish morons, and granny killers. I can personally attest that peaceful protesters were wrongly characterized as violent anti-lockdowners. A study 20 claimed that non-mask wearers were more likely to be psychopaths. History reverberates with examples of deliberate attempts to dehumanize and divide people, and it has never ended well. So, why do governments use fear? Simply, it encourages compliance. A meta-analysis has found that messages with fear are nearly twice as effective as messages without fear. 21 At a time when there is political disengagement, fear cuts through. How do you get your population to take heed? Scare them. Fear suppresses rational thinking and they are more likely to do what they are told. I spoke to political scientist, Piers Robinson, about fear. He was the chair in politics, society and political journalism at Sheffield University, leaving in 2019 to focus on his work as co-director at the Organisation for Propaganda Studies. Piers has been smeared for disputing the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So he has studied propaganda and also, depending on your viewpoint, been at the other end of it. I asked if he thought governments were leveraging fear as a form of social control. He said, "If something very big is going on in the world, you should always ask if it can be exploited for reasons that are entirely separate from what the primary concerns appear to be. COVID is an event of such scale that there is the potential for actors to exploit it for various agendas. Never let a good crisis go to waste," and so on. You can be open-minded about both the severity of the disease and the potential for exploitation. 9/11 is an example. That event led to 20 years of warfare which wasn't about fighting terrorism but was enabled by the war on terror narrative. When the Chilcot Report published communications between Tony Blair and George Bush and they were talking about 9/11 and attacking various countries, it was obvious that the war on terror was to be used as propaganda to fight different wars for other reasons. I put it to him that our anxieties have developed in a trajectory from Cold War to the war on terror to a war on viruses. He agreed, but shot back, "We destroyed other countries in the war on terror. This time we're destroying our own." I asked Robinson how and why a government would destroy its own country. He was keen to clarify he didn't mean a caricature of conspiracy theory, but rather vested interests and agendas which coalesce. No social scientist would dispute we live in a world where there exist powerful actors with agendas. One of the ways through which agendas are pushed is propaganda. I would call this a major propaganda opportunity. Propaganda is Robinson's speciality, so I asked how he observed it at play. He was cautious, explaining that this was such a large event it would take months to research fully, but that censorship had raised a red flag. Very early on it was clear that eminent scientists were questioning the approach. It's likely the threat was being overplayed because some dissenting and credible scientists were being censored. The utility of lockdown, for example, has been extremely difficult to debate in public. Bad decision-making and groupthink could also be behind this, but there is manipulation of the narrative through propaganda going on as well. Censorship is one of the tools of propaganda. Others are false flags. The use of covert operations that appear to be carried out by other states, repetition, manipulation of the facts, lying, and the manipulation of emotions, notably fear. People have been gripped by fear in an obsessive way, and to a degree far worse than occurred with fear of terrorism, said Robinson. Propaganda is all about behavioral psychology, manipulation essentially, getting people to do what they wouldn't otherwise do, through coercion, or incentive or deception. Not all persuasion is propaganda, but propaganda is manipulation and it is not democratic. The way some behavioral scientists have acted during the COVID-19 response runs the risk of unethical conduct. I think we should investigate and hold to account the professionals complicit in this. We in academia need to think about the ethics of this more. When I research and write, I do not try and manipulate people. I am trying to get to the truth and inform people. When will political scientists and historians have a clear perspective on the motives and tactics used in the government's COVID policies, if it took 20 years to understand the war on terror? In the fullness of time it will become clearer, Robinson said, as long we don't lose democracy, because it's not inconceivable that we are walking into an absolute nightmare in which freedom of speech and debate become significantly curtailed.